Well, hello everybody and welcome to this month's RSA Webinar. I'm Dr. Meredith Doig, President of the Rationalist Society of Australia, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. Now, before we begin, I'd like to invite you to join me in acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land and to sea and to community. Tonight, it's a real pleasure to have with us Dr. Benjamin Jones, an academic from Central Queensland University. Ben is an historian with expertise in Australian political history, especially republicanism, the Republic movement, or the history of the Republic movement, but also our national identity. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a Foundation Fellow of the Australian Studies Institute, and he served as the National Secretary of the Australian Historical Association. Before joining CQU, Central Queensland University, in 2019, Ben was an ARC, Australian Research Council Fellow at ANU, and he's also taught at the universities of Sydney, of New South Wales, and at Western Sydney University. But in addition, he's also held visiting fellow posts at the University of Cologne, Indiana University, and Durham University, and he's worked as an historian at the Museum of Australian Democracy. In addition to all that, I don't know whether he finds the time to do all this, but still, he's a regular writer with The Conversation, and he's a frequent guest on radio, and he's quoted and interviewed for the mainstream press on Australian politics. And in addition to all that, he has recently joined me on the National Committee of the Australian Republic Movement, where I am sure his in-depth knowledge of the history of the Republican movement is going to be particularly welcome. So very, very busy. He's got a young family as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Jones. Ben, over to you.
Good evening, colleagues. It's my great pleasure to speak with you this evening, and thanks to your outstanding president, Meredith, for the kind invitation, and also to Sai, who helped organise this evening's event. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Darumbal people on whose lands I live and work. And although it is indeed a great pleasure to speak with you, it's also with a tone of sadness for the recent referendum result. Personally, I was in favour of the voice to Parliament because, firstly, I recognised it as a gift from First Nations leaders who drafted the Uluru Statement, but also I recognised it as quite a minor change to our constitution, a change that would create an advisory body with no power except the power to exist and the power to offer advice. And I'm disheartened by the conduct of the No campaign and its parliamentary supporters who deliberately and continuously peddled disinformation. We saw a shameful display with claims that the voice could comment on everything from submarines to parking tickets. And this is contradicting the advice of the Solicitor General, the Law Council of Australia, and a group of 71 law academics who wrote an open letter saying that it was not a risky change. And that's just the behaviour of some politicians. The situation was far more disheartening when you looked at the behaviour of some of the No groups and certainly online trolls. At one point, I was contacted by the Australian Associated Press to fact-check a rather insane falsehood that the voice had already been rejected at the 1999 referendum. And as an expert on republicanism, I can very much assure you that nothing even close to the voice was in either of those two proposals. And as an educator, I was disheartened by this insidious catchphrase, if you don't know vote no. And one imagines they could add, for good measure, please don't bother to find out. Not only is this appeal to ignorance anathema to any sense of civic education and public education and participation in our democracy, but it also legitimizes laziness and provides fertile ground for noxious conspiracy theories that perhaps this is a Trojan horse to let the United Nations take your backyard for one world government. And as the claims got more divorced from reality, the Yes camp found themselves spending more time debunking falsehoods and less time making the case for their non-binding advisory body. And finally, I was disheartened by the performance of our highly concentrated media class. Far from the vital function of the fourth estate in educating the public, under a shaky justification of balance, false equivalency was made between expert and non-expert opinion. Demonstrably false no claims were repeated without correction or context, and the high levels of reports that millions of Australians did not really understand what the vote was about did not seem to inspire any urgent desire for public education. And you can imagine if someone's living in the suburbs, working extra shifts to try and counter the rising cost of living, growing mortgage repayments or rent, and they only had time to casually flip through the weekend paper or have the 6 o'clock news on in the background, you could excuse them from our media's performance for not knowing that legal opinion was overwhelmingly behind the voice. And in my own profession of history, I was one of 350 historians who wrote an open letter in support of the voice. And again, this was barely mentioned by the media. Similarly, a casual observer would probably not realise that Indigenous people themselves strongly supported the voice. The BBC's editorial principle of due impartiality should perhaps be adopted in Australia. Due impartiality does not mean an obligation to blindly give equal airtime to all sides of a debate, but to provide facts and context, to provide credible experts, and to educate the public. But to zoom the lens out from the voice referendum, I'm disheartened because I believe this result is bad for our democracy, and it demonstrates what the leading constitutional expert of his day, Geoffrey Saw, argued in 1967. He said, constitutionally speaking, we are a frozen continent. And my melancholy opinion is that at present, it's functionally impossible to change the constitution. And you may say, well, that's an emotional overreaction to the voice defeat, and that the voice campaigners themselves made various missteps. But I'm not really focused so much on the voice as the past 50 years, where we've now rejected 10 consecutive proposals. That's not to say things cannot change, only that creativity, energy, and political will is required. Our mechanism for changing the Constitution is outlined in Section 128, and it awkwardly tries to balance these three foundational ideas. Only the federal parliament has the power to put forward a proposal, so that's representative government. But it then requires the approval of an overall majority of voters, so that's popular democracy. But it also requires an approval from the majority of states, and so that third thread is an appeal to federalism. And according to one political scientist, this double majority makes Australia's constitution the fifth most difficult to change. And we now have law textbooks from the past quarter of a century, which will all need to update the dismal statistic of 8 successful proposals from 44 attempts in their new editions to read 8 from 45. And of course, it's not necessarily a bad thing for a success rate to be at 18%. If open and intelligent public debate had taken place and informed citizens chose to keep the status quo, then that's democracy in action. And rejecting a bad proposal should be celebrated as much as accepting a good one. I think most people would agree that ideally the Constitution shouldn't be changed lightly or frivolously, but nor should it be impossible. And even the 8 successful attempts possibly disguise how truly difficult it is to pass a referendum. 3 of the successful changes were all from 1977, which was a pretty extraordinary political situation. You'd just had the explosive Whitlam dismissal, and with bipartisan support from Labor, there was a strong community sense that change was needed to ensure this doesn't happen again, by making it unconstitutional to not replace a senator with someone from the same party. The other 2 proposals were to count voters in the NT and ACT in referendums, and to have a retirement age for judges. So they were both common sense changes, but more importantly, it was a bipartisan setting, and with this backdrop of a constitutional crisis. To invert the tedious catch cry of 1999, there was a palpable sense of, it is broke, we better fix it. 1967 was also an extraordinary circumstance. There was clear discrimination against First Nations, and there was no opposition to the proposal to address that. Again, the political backdrop was the US civil rights movement, the global anti-racism movement, and that all culminates to explain the very high yes vote. But even under those circumstances, the second proposal was rejected, and this was a common sense piece of constitutional upkeep to allow the number of MPs to increase without necessarily increasing the number of senators, a proposal with bipartisan support, and it still failed. Before that, there was a successful referendum in 1946 to allow the Commonwealth to provide social services in the post-World War II years. Again, very exceptional circumstance. So if we count those 5 occasions as successes which required the proposals to not only have merit and bipartisan support, but also some sort of extraordinary backdrop to facilitate a public attitude for constitutional change, that leaves us with just 3 from 45 that passed under relatively mundane circumstances, although still requiring bipartisanship. In 1906, there was a change to allow elections for both houses to happen simultaneously. In 1910, the Commonwealth was given power to take over state debts, and in 1928, that was rescinded. So just 8 successful proposals in total. Most of them required extraordinary political circumstances. A couple were just transparently common sense. All of them had bipartisan support. But again, it's not the number that should concern us so much as the circumstances. We've now had 37 failed proposals. Were all of these bad ideas that the public wisely rejected after thoughtful consideration? Were they all unpopular? Did our citizens really understand what they were voting for or against? On any particular proposal, people will rush to give their reasons for voting yes or no, and it's tempting to divorce this from the broader analysis of our democracy. But if you'll excuse a poor attempt at Socratic dialogue, we might start by asking, what do we agree on? Do we agree it should be possible to change the Constitution? I think even members of the Samuel Griffiths Society might reluctantly concede that point. So if so, what would be the ideal circumstances for an intelligent, informed public debate? And does Section 128 of the Constitution and the relevant legislation, the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act, do enough to foster those ideal circumstances? As I've already said, I think we are at a nadir in our constitutional history where change is almost functionally impossible. One of the merits of our Constitution as a whole, however, is that it has internal flexibility, and governments have been able to make effective changes through legislation and protocol without needing to go to a referendum and change the actual wording. An example would be the relative power of the Commonwealth to the states, which has increased without a referendum, that almost certainly would be defeated, incidentally, or the fact that Australia itself has gradually become republic-like without becoming technically a republic. But we're still left with this Gordian knot that has proved almost impossible to untangle. On the one hand, there's almost universal agreement that our Constitution is out of date in many areas. Conservatives and progressives agree on this. In many cases, they even agree on what changes we should make. recognising local government, 4-year terms for federal MPs, breaking the nexus between the numbers in the House and the Senate. Proposals like this have been thrown around since the 70s, and often they've been backed also by constitutional commissions, constitutional conventions, legal academics, and other experts. But almost every attempt to modernise it and every single attempt in the past half century has been struck down by hyper-partisanship. And perhaps the most egregious example of this was in 1984, when the Liberal Party campaigned against Labor's proposal to ensure elections for the House and Senate were on the same day. The reason this was quite hypocritical is because the Liberal Fraser government had put the same proposal forward in 1977. It was the only one of the 4 proposals not to get up, despite 62% supporting it nationally, but it only carried 3 of 6 states. In 1984, despite the Liberals campaigning against it now, it still got a national majority of 50.6%, but this time only 2 out of 6 seats. Although it did carry a majority in the NT and the ACT. So there's a few things to consider from this example. Firstly, is it fair or democratic that a proposal that a majority of Australians endorsed twice has not been accepted? Ironically, the Whitlam government tried to change Section 128 at a referendum in 1974 to require only half the states rather than a majority as the benchmark. And had the Liberals supported that and it got up, then their own proposal in 1977 would have gotten up as well. Indeed, another 5 referendums would have passed if 3 out of 6 states was the benchmark. But it also begs a question, are we comfortable under the auspices of federalism to have a system where citizens have stronger or weaker voting power depending on where they live? As a former resident of the ACT, I'm painfully aware that every election I voted at, my vote counted far less than a voter in Sydney and less than a voter in similarly sized Tasmania, which returns 12 senators to Canberra's 2. Indeed, Canberrans and Territorians votes didn't even contribute to the overall tally until 1977. And the fact that the ACT voted yes to the Voice and also yes to the Republic is just this sort of small, quirky footnote rather than a statistic of real relevance. But the real significance of 1984 is that it began this pattern of hyperpartisanship, which continues to this day and which has contaminated the results of every referendum since. Why did the Liberals oppose a change they themselves had put forward just 7 years earlier? Fraser was gone by 84, but the new Liberal leader, Andrew Peacock, and his factional rival, John Howard, had both been ministers in his government and had publicly argued for the change. My reading of history is that 1984 marked a political, to use Thomas Kuhn's term, paradigm shift, which suitably enough in 1984 is rather Orwellian, at least for those of us who want the Constitution to be changeable. But it did set this template that has remained in place. If the government proposes a referendum, the job of the opposition is to oppose it. And if 1984 dawned this paradigm shift, it was cemented in 1988. Now, ironically, the change Hawke really wanted in the 80s was for the Commonwealth to be able to legislate the incorporation of companies, but he knew that would be too easy to oppose and sink in a referendum. So he sidestepped it and entered highly complex negotiations with the states, and instead put forward this referendum. Hawke and his Attorney General, Lionel Bowen, put forward 4 proposals specifically designed to wedge the opposition. 4 proposals which they thought were so modest, so popular, and with so much appeal to Conservative voters that surely the opposition would have to grudgingly support at least some of them. 4-year terms for MPs, which Howard, by this stage the party leader, had previously supported. Ensuring fair elections. This was specifically aimed at Queensland, where a regional gerrymander under Joh Bjelke-Petersen, the infamous Bjelke-mander, favoured national seats. And although it hurt Labor, it actually took more seats away from the Liberals. recognising local government and protecting a range of freedoms, including the right to jury trial, guaranteeing a government must pay fair terms when acquiring property, and protecting freedom of religion. Much like the voice referendum, before the campaign started, all of these ideas had support at around 60%. The proposals themselves had come from a 1985 Constitutional Commission that was chaired by former Solicitor General Sir Maurice Sabias, hardly a progressive person, included prominent law professors Enid Campbell, Leslie Zines, and Federal Court Judge John Toohey, former Labor Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, and former Liberal Premier of Victoria, Sir Rupert Hamer. So there was this concerted effort to try and depoliticise the referendum process. And Hawke's Attorney General, later the Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, he also co-wrote a book with the former Liberal Attorney General, Haddon Story, as another attempt to show bipartisanship and show ways where both sides of politics could agree it needs to be modernised. But despite devising what they thought was the perfect wedge, Hawke and Bowen were dismayed that Howard and the Liberals saw through it and campaigned for a simple no on all four. And there's a lot more to this story, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But for the sake of time, I'll just stress that this was the least successful referendum in our history. All four were squashed, barely got a third of the vote. And the proposal to enshrine rights and freedoms did the worst of the lot, the lowest yes vote in the history of our referendums. And there's no doubt that Hawke and Bowen made some serious campaign blunders, but one does wonder if small changes like this on issues that most people would say in principle they strongly support, if even they can't get up, what hope is there for substantial reform that may be wanted or needed in the future? The 1999 referendum on a republic is an oddity in that it was put forward by a prime minister who actively campaigned against it. The mood in the mid-90s was strongly in favour of a republic in principle. Again, the polls showed consistent support in the 60s. One in 1996 actually was as high as 75%. Howard becomes Prime Minister in this year and makes a campaign promise to hold a constitutional convention, then a referendum. Despite a Liberal government introducing this referendum and despite support from prominent Conservatives, including Peter Costello, the Treasurer, this one also fell victim to partisanship. And the messaging, even after 1996, was still that this is a Labor republic, Keating's republic. Although, along with Howard, you had a young Tony Abbott making a public profile for himself as leading the campaign against a republic. Abbott entered federal politics in 1994, and he was very much in the Howard mode, and he accepted this paradigm that an opposition's job is to oppose what the government puts forward, including at referendums. If you'll excuse the imagery, he once described himself as the political love child of John Howard and Bronwyn Bishop. But again, the problem with this approach when applied to constitutional reform is not only does it make it virtually impossible for Labor governments to pass a referendum, and note that only one of the successful 8 came from Labor, but it also makes the coalition unlikely to even bother trying. Because, of course, if you've got this record of constantly blocking every Labor referendum, you can reasonably expect that if you want to put something up, they're probably going to block your proposals as well. And fast forward then to 2013, there was stated bipartisan support for another referendum to recognise local councils. Despite this, after becoming Prime Minister, Abbott abandoned any plans for a referendum. And you can't help but wonder if part of his rationale was he was simply too invested, he'd invested too much political capital in sinking referendums, and he didn't want to experience some of his own tactics then used against him. And as a historian, I often joke that I'll make predictions about anything except the future, but I'll break that rule and say, I think if Peter Dutton becomes Prime Minister, he won't hold a referendum on Indigenous recognition either, and for much the same reason. And I'd like to stress this point also. I'm not assigning blame to the Liberals for freezing our constitution. On any of the past 10 referendum proposals, reasonable people could make a case for yes or no. And more generally, it's natural enough in a two-party system that the progressive side will be more enthusiastic for constitutional change, while the conservative side would lean towards the status quo. But as a historian, I try to look at the longue durée and observe patterns and trends. And it does appear that over the last half century, our ability to modernise the constitution has slowly ground to a halt. In every decade of the 20th century, there was at least one attempt to change the constitution. After the failures in 1988, it took over a decade for the Republic in 1999. After that, it took over 2 decades for the Voice. With that now defeated, will we have to wait 3 decades for another opportunity? And if it is now entrenched that the coalition will oppose any Labor referendum, and the reverse is likely true also, then what government on either side is even going to bother? And if a referendum does get proposed, do we have any reason to believe that our politicians will surrender their partisan lances, or that the public will gain any great appetite for constitutional knowledge so that it can cast an informed vote? So with my rapidly diminishing time, I want to ponder if Section 128 itself is fit for purpose. The Constitution writers in the 1890s spent considerable time examining how amendments should be made. In particular, they looked to the United States, which has a very high bar. 2/3 of both houses of Congress need to request a change, and then 3/4 of state legislatures have to ratify it. Now, in Australia, they were worried that there would be too much horse trading and the proposals would not be judged on their merits. So they also spent a lot of time examining the Swiss constitution, which has a similar model to the double majority. So ironically, the actual purpose of Section 128 was to be a circuit breaker, to depoliticize constitutional change by throwing it to the people. At the Adelaide Convention in 1897, the future first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, said that while I would not say the Constitution should be such as could only be amended by force of arms, I hope we shall provide all necessary safeguards against it being lightly amended. So don't worry, Edmund, you definitely succeeded on that one. Quick and Garron, who authored the most significant annotation to each section of the Constitution in 1901, also stressed this need for balance, not too easy, but not impossible either. They wrote that of the double majority, these safeguards have been provided not to prevent or indefinitely resist change, but in order to prevent change being made in haste or by stealth, and to encourage public discussion. If you simply look at the numbers again at 18% success rate, it's tempting to say, well, Section 128 is working as intended. But I suggest that's too simplistic and ignores the nature of these debates and the opportunity for the public to intelligently debate changes. And it also warps the reality that the success rate in the last 50 years is 0. It's important to understand also that in the late 19th century, this was a time of great small L liberal optimism. As the Funda Cycle approached the dawn of the 20th century, there was this genuine teleological belief that with technology and mass education, we were marching towards some kind of new enlightened civilization, and that Australia would lead the world in democratic advancements. We already introduced the secret ballot, votes for all men. By 1902, all women also, noting that First Nations were included in the original constitution, only to be excluded explicitly in sections 51 and 127. But still, this is the political atmosphere in which they were writing the Constitution. And there was this expectation that with free secular education, every citizen would be able to rationally and intelligently debate points of constitutional change. 120 years later, perhaps it is time to consider that a failed experiment. For all our advances, our general knowledge of the Constitution today is no better than it was in the first decade after Federation, and quite possibly is worse. One survey in the 1980s found that only half of Australians even know we have a constitution, and far less could name a single item in it. During the Voice campaign, we had a painful demonstration that a huge number of our citizens do not understand the difference between legislation and the Constitution. How then can we expect an intelligent debate on a referendum? One answer, of course, is mass education on civics and citizenship, but that was also suggested in the wake of 1984, 88, 99, and now 2023. But this also brings up a more philosophical question. What does it mean to live in a free democratic society? If I don't care was an option at the recent referendum, or indeed any of them, I'm confident it would have beaten both the yes and no tallies. And I say this as someone who is strongly committed to civic education, political participation, and compulsory voting. But for the purpose of a referendum, I've shifted to supporting an optional vote. Indeed, I'd even go one further and support a requirement of passing a short, free online knowledge test on basic facts about the Constitution with unlimited attempts before someone can vote. But at the very least, dropping this requirement that people who don't know and don't care must cast a vote, and dropping this Victorian fantasy that our society will eventually evolve into a new Athens where every citizen attends the polis and has an active interest in politics of the day, would, I think, be a step in the right direction. But even if there was optional voting, what can be done about the hyperpartisanship? I'll offer two possible suggestions, then invite questions. It's clear that trust in politicians and public confidence in our parliament is at a low point. So an alternative to the government of the day introducing a referendum proposal is to introduce either an expert or a popular trigger to force a referendum. To insert a referendum trigger into the Constitution, of course, would itself require a referendum, but it could also simply be legislated. And while that means a future government could repeal the legislation, given that one party rarely controls both houses, it would not necessarily be easy. And if this legislation was in place for years and then decades, it is likely to become part of our political culture and unlikely to be repealed. So firstly, an expert trigger. This could take the form of a constitutional commission made up of non-partisan or bipartisan legal experts, like former constitutional commissions. This could be made up of former judges, legal academics, and if former politicians are involved, it would need to be transparent and bipartisan with both major parties represented. But the key would be to create a body that has high levels of public trust, or at least higher than the current political class, which may not be such a high bar. The legislation might dictate perhaps once a decade or once every 15 years, the Commission puts forward a number of proposals and these automatically go to a referendum, removing the perception that this is a government initiative, removing the impulse on the opposition that they necessarily have to oppose it, and giving more of a chance that the proposal could be judged on its merit. A popular trigger has been debated in Australia actually for decades, and it's often called the citizens-initiated referenda. Most recently, in 2013, a DLP senator, and no, I didn't get the dates wrong, there was a DLP senator in 2013, amazingly, anyway, introduced such a bill. If passed, any citizen would put forward a proposal to the AEC. They would check it to make sure it actually does impact require a change in the Constitution. Once verified, it would need to get signatures equaling 1% of enrolled citizens. In 2013, that would be about 150,000, today 170,000. The AEC would then verify that the signatures are legitimate, and if so, this would automatically trigger a referendum. Again, the appeal of this trigger is that the referendum doesn't come from government, and doesn't have to be opposed by the opposition. In fact, I imagine an opposition seeking to make itself more popular would actually seize on a trigger like this. Just for context, 170,000 unique signatures, that's a high bar. The largest petition in Australian history was for a royal commission into the Murdoch media, which received 500,000, but that was pretty extraordinary, backed by former Prime Ministers Rudd and Turnbull. But for that 500,000 who signed it, it was probably also a bit frustrating that then just nothing happens. Whereas with this popular trigger, something would automatically happen. It would be outside the hands of the government. Few proposals would reach 170,000. We wouldn't be going to the polls every week. And under the 2013 legislation, which was rejected, there would be a set referendum year, once every 4 years, and however many, if any, reach that 170,000 just automatically go to a referendum in the next referendum year. And the other thing about that is it would also make referendums a regular part of Australian political life again, not a rarity we see every quarter of a century. But the issue with both triggers is it means the government would have to surrender, or the parliament, would have to surrender its exclusive right to call a referendum. Citizens-initiated referenda, they've been proposed not only at federal level, here in Queensland and in other states. None of them have got up. So again, we're left with this awkward tension between representative government, popular democracy, and federalism. There are ways forward to thaw our frozen constitution. The most difficult is direct change, another referendum to drop the double majority, for instance. Next is legislation for a referendum trigger. And the least difficult, but by no means easy change, would be to amend the referendum legislation to require some kind of truth in political advertising, fact-checking for the official yes and no cases, and other efforts to combat mis and disinformation. Because what we do know is that high levels of constitutional ignorance coupled with low levels of political interest is a proven recipe for failure. And just finally, constitutional reform isn't a left-right issue. It doesn't sit on the Labor-Liberal divide or Greens Nationals or anyone else. As Robert Menzies said, a written constitution is an expressed scheme of government designed to give a basic structure in a changing world, not designed to inhibit growth in a growing world, not to make the contemporary world subject to the political, social, and economic ideas of a bygone age. The Constitution should not be a straitjacket. So choose whatever metaphor you like, frozen in time, stuck in a straitjacket. But if we have reached the stage where constitutional change is virtually impossible, then it is broke and it's time to fix it. Thank you.
Ben, thank you so much. I sometimes interrupt our guest speakers to ask questions of clarification, but I was so fascinated with not just your backgrounding of the history of referenda in Australia, but then you very usefully went on to suggest some ways that we could actually move forwards. And this has always been one of the things that I admired about you. I read your articles in the conversation, and they are almost universally very creative, but constructive in thinking about, yes, we've got a problem. Let's not just complain about it. Let's see what we can do to try to move the action forwards. There are a few questions that people have sent in beforehand, and if I might, I'll use the remaining time that we've got to ask those questions of you. And the first one is from Lawrence Roberts from Tasmania, who asked just directly, how then, given the rather depressing scenario that you painted about the success rate of referenda, how do you think we should begin to move towards Australia becoming a republic and having an Australian as head of state rather than an aristocrat from another country in a bygone era? Any ideas?
Yes, and appointed by divine right. Thank you very much for the question. I think what the Voice referendum has really clearly demonstrated is that the conventional wisdom of bipartisanship, certainly not guaranteeing success, but lack of bipartisanship virtually guaranteeing failure, that advice needs to be heeded. And so I think for passionate Republicans, it is a matter of making a lot of noise to your local member, but I think particularly to those on the Conservative side, and perhaps framing questions like this: what would a sensible republic to a Conservative voter look like? What is likely to appeal to people who support the Nationals and the Liberal Party, and indeed people who are members of those parties? Labor in this situation is a little bit easier to get on board in that it is in Labor's platform to become a republic. So really the challenge is getting the Liberals on board. In the current climate, if I had Albanese's ear, I would say don't start a republic referendum unless you already have had behind the scenes talks with the leader of the opposition and have guaranteed bipartisan support, because history suggests that really is the vital ingredient. And for people who do support the Conservative parties and also a republic, I think there's a great opportunity for you to mention this at your branch meetings and when you're talking to your local member.
Just following up a little bit on that, you did mention during your talk, and this is a question from Andrew Holliday, that we are the country that has the fifth hardest mechanism for changing our constitution. Would you like to just say a little bit more, which is the hardest, or which countries might we recognise are even harder than ours? And what makes it harder for them compared to ours?
Sure. So that was Donald Lutz, a American political scientist who actually put his own country as the hardest, because getting that 3/4 of state legislatures in that, as anyone who follows American politics knows, they have their own hyper-partisanship, and then even within the Conservative side, the Trumpian faction of the Republican Party is almost its own party within the Republican Party. So I suppose it's the fact that it's completely up to politicians who may well have other agendas in shaping how they look at these things. But I should note also that our very eminent constitutional law professor in Australia, George Williams, has actually contended that Australia actually is number one, and that Lutz hadn't factored in how difficult our double majority is. And of course, it's only double majority for some. There are other ones in the Constitution that actually require a triple majority. If you want to reduce the number of senators in some states, it requires not only an overall majority, a majority of states, but also the state in question has to. So it's, I actually lean towards the Williams in thinking we might actually be number one.
And yet, the American Constitution has a number of amendments to it that are often cited by politicians on both sides to bolster their arguments. arguments. How did they come about?
There's was a flurry in the immediate post-Revolutionary War period. So the entire Bill of Rights is the first 10, but I wish I could quickly Google, but I think it actually was 1982, so still a long while ago was the last one, and that actually was ratifying. This was it's quite a great little story. It's worth reading up on it, but it actually was a law student in the United States who found that first part, the 2/3 of Congress had agreed on a change back in 17 something or rather, and he argued, well, it's still alive now, and then he started a public petition to get those 3/4 of state legislatures. But yeah, so 77 for us, 1982 for them. It's been a while between drinks for both of us, and I think proportionately in how many versus how many attempts, it's actually quite similar as well. So difficult in both countries.
You've mentioned at least 3 options for how we might move forward with reform to make the mechanism for changing our constitution at least more fit for purpose, let's call it that. And they were firstly encouraging that rather than a compulsory vote, that it be an optional vote on constitutional questions or questions put to the people, so that people who really don't care or who don't know then are not required to vote one way or the other. It's people who do care and have perhaps informed themselves one way or the other who then vote. So that's the first one. The second one was having experts, like a panel of constitutional put together, who put up a series of suggested amendments which technically would make the Constitution a better document, presumably. And the third one was the popular trigger, the dreaded citizens-initiated referenda. I remember when I was growing up, that was an anathema to any of us on the progressive side of politics. So those 3 possible, well, actually, yes, 3 possible solutions. Of those 3, which do you think are doable, feasible in the, let's say, short to medium term?
I am inclined to think that certainly I think anyone who's actually been on the hastings handing out how to votes, either for a political party or during a referendum, probably gets a fair gauge that as people go past, you get maybe 30, maybe 40% who seem quite enthusiastic, who grab, and you get a lot of people with like, oh, I wish I wasn't here. I wish I was doing anything else on this Saturday. So I think switching it to optional voting would probably be the easiest to get up, because I think it actually would be a popular change, in that people who don't want to vote would obviously be very keen, but I think a lot of people who do vote also would be happy enough to have that. So that would probably be the easiest. With the popular triggers, in a sense, because they would require the federal government to give up their power, their exclusive power to call referendums, they're sort of equally unlikely, sadly, because it always tends to be, ironically, the one time they ever are bipartisan, they're bipartisan in blocking either one, because they know, well, I might be in opposition now, but later I'm going to be in government, and I don't want to be in government and have a referendum forced upon me where I might be, my policy suite is what I want to do, not have a constitutional expert, and probably even less enthusiasm for having a popular trigger. So that one would be difficult. But then I suppose the flip side is, the longer we go without a single change to our constitution, no matter how mild, this may perhaps soften the political class into considering it. And I would say that the government is more likely to favour the expert panel, though, because they would still have, there's forever the fear of the great unwashed, I guess, and especially if they had some power over at least appointing the Constitutional Commission, they may be more inclined to take its advice.
Andrew Holliday has a couple of questions, and I do encourage anybody else to either put a question that might occur to you, or even a comment in the chat box. For those of you who don't know where it is, click on the 3 little dots that says more, and you'll find that the chat box pops up for you. So just following up on that most recent question about the options for reform, Andrew says, a number of demographers have been making the point recently that traditional conservatives aren't being replaced anymore, that they're literally dying off, and younger voters now predominantly voted yes, at least in the most recent referendum. Do you have any thoughts on the potential implications for this, for constitutional change in the future? That is, is the Generation Z, the next generations coming up, are they more likely to be oriented towards reform?
On something like The Voice, I think there probably is some truth to that. I think they're definitely Kosamaris, a pollster in Victoria, has made the point that the 1835 demographic were as pro-voice as the 55 and older were against. But I don't think that necessarily represents a broader appetite or enthusiasm for constitutional change. I think that was probably topic specific to the 18 to 35 cohort having a particular interest in social justice for Indigenous people. As I've tried to stress, Labor have been more enthusiastic about constitutional reform historically, but it really doesn't sit on the left-right. I mean, it's something like 4-year terms. It's absolutely apolitical. It's just the system that seems to work well. All the states virtually have already adopted it, and it just seems to make sense. The argument is basically in your first year of a new government, you're still finding your feet. In the third year, you're already in campaign mode, which really only leaves you sort of 1 year of really getting on with the business of governing. And so extending that to 2 years, I really can't imagine that favours left or right Labor or Liberal. It's just, in my opinion, a good idea. And those are the sorts of things which it's a real shame. The Constitutional Commission, actually, that Hawke started in 85, wrote this terrific 1,000-page long 2-volume extended book on a whole range of ways, and I don't think any of them really were overtly political or had an obvious place on the left-right grid. But the final report actually got tabled after the 88 referendum had already happened. So they'd spent, years and millions of dollars creating this wonderful resource, which almost nobody has ever read. And yeah, so anyway, so I'm getting a bit off track, but no, I don't think younger people are more keen for constitutional change. I think they're specifically keen for Indigenous recognition.
Okay. Here's a further relevant question from Andrew Holliday. Considering the optimism of the liberal 19th century and the early 20th century, along with Australia's early international reputation as being a leading democratic and progressive country up to World War I, could we understand what's happening over the past half century as indicative of a transition from modernity to a postmodern Western framework?
Geez, that's a great question, Andrew, and a really, really thoughtful one. I think you certainly could make that argument that this sort of, that we are in some sort of post-modernity where it's no longer these ideals, and really civic republicanism is what was this undercurrent in this enthusiasm for collective participation, and it explains why we got compulsory voting in Australia. But who knows? Maybe we are heading to some postmodernist Australia where AI or ChatGPT will, write our legislation for us, and however utopian or nightmarish that kind of vision is for the future. But it's a good thought.
Certainly, it seems that the advent of postmodernism in academia has led to the increase in mistrust and distrust of institutions and the elites, whoever they might be. And that's been, and also a rise in the idea of misinformation and disinformation, because postmodernism suggests that there is no single truth, that there is no reality. It only is what people read into it. So there's no independent standard against which to judge facts or truth. It's all just opinion.
I couldn't agree more. One of my recent books is called History in a Post-Truth World, and I think this was a post-truth referendum. And what post-truth means, it's not the same as lying. There've always been lies. People have always had propaganda and trying to trick you. But post-truth is, it's not even necessarily always being wrong or false with your information, but the key to post-truth is indifference. That whether it's true or not, it doesn't really matter. Whether this did already get put in the 99 referendum, who cares? It's more this connection between the portrayer of false information, the purveyor of false information, and the recipient, that they sort of have this agreement that they're on the same side. And if their arguments happen to be true, good. If they happen to not be true, it doesn't matter. And for people who still believe in truth and believe in facts and believe in changing your mind based on facts, which is almost the definition of a rationalist, it can be quite distressing, because you take for granted that if someone's saying, I oppose this referendum because of this, and you think, well, if I can just show them actually that's wrong, then they might come over to my side. But we're seeing this phenomenon in a post-truth referendum where it actually makes them dig in further and say, well, look, it wasn't really about that point. This is just my stance. And I'm more or less immovable on it, because it's based on emotion and it's based on feeling, not on rationality, logic, facts, and the stronger argument.
And you're quite right that as a rationalist, it is very distressing to see the rise of postmodernism and what the effects of postmodernism on people's assumption about what is true and what is not true, and the cynicism, I think, that has accompanied those changes. We're leading up to 8:30, where we're going to wrap this up, but I might just come back to a question that was sent in by Gillian Sullivan from Queensland, and hopefully this is a slightly more optimistic question. Gillian writes, why is there such poor knowledge of Australia's history and the Constitution? Who's responsible for the curriculum? What can we do to improve our knowledge of civics and our history? Should civics and history be compulsory?
So for the who, it is the states who ultimately have their own education curriculums, but we do also have a national curriculum which the states have voluntarily signed up. But I won't give you a very long answer, but for reasons of practicality, it was too hard to take things out. Anything you want to take out, there's someone who says, no, that's the most important thing. So they tended to sort of add everything in instead. And the net result is that a lot of things get pushed over really quickly. So federation, civics, how our government and society and politics works, it is in the curriculum, but it's the type of thing which, unless you're a particularly passionate student, you can be sick for 2 weeks and you've missed the whole thing, and it's only if you're really interested. And one other tricky thing is that there are some civics and constitutional education groups, or they frame themselves that way, but they are actually people who oppose any referendum and oppose any change, and their materials tend to all be why our constitution is perfect. And so it is very, very tricky. Certainly not in another 20 seconds. I don't think I can come up with a solution to that.
Benjamin, I was hoping that was going to be a little bit more uplifting and optimistic for the future. But look, I think once we've got people like you who spend your lifetime and your intellectual power to make sure that we don't ignore our history, that we do come up with creative solutions, and it's a hard slog. But we chip away at it. And if people of goodwill like you and the people who are watching this webinar who do believe that we can improve, that there are some things, obviously, that we should learn from tradition, and we should value and cherish certain traditions, but that doesn't mean to say that everything should be opposed, that we should be looking towards how do we make not just our constitution, but all of our institutions better for the people. So you're making a terrific contribution to that, and I thank you very much for it. I look forward to working with you on the National Committee of the Australian Republic Movement, and whilst it may not happen in the immediate term, let's hope it does happen, at least in our lifetimes. Ben, thank you very much. And to all the people who are watching, thank you for joining us tonight. And don't forget that we will be having another RSA webinar, same time next month. And with that, I'll say goodnight and let you get off to your evenings. And Ben, to your little 5-year-old girl who I'm sure needs you right now. So thank you.
Yeah, she's right behind me. Thanks, Meredith. Thank you.
Okay. Cheers. Bye for now.